Let's begin with the chapter 1, metabolic response to injury. If we look into the basic concepts of homeostasis, in the 18th and 19th century, a series of eminent scientists laid the foundation of our understanding of homeostasis and response to injury. The classical concepts of homeostasis and response to injury are: 1. The stability of milieu interior. The milieu interior is the primary condition for freedom and independence of existence. The word was given by Claude Bernard. Important. The body systems act to maintain internal constancy. Second is homeostasis. It is the coordinated physiological process which maintains most of the steady state of the organisms, given by Walter Cannon. For example, the complex homeostasis responses involving the brain, nerves, heart, lungs, kidney, and spleen work to maintain body constancy. There is a circumstance attending accidental injury which does not belong to the disease, namely that the injury done has in all cases a tendency to produce both the deposition and means of cure. John Hunter. It was given by John Hunter. John Hunter is also known as the father of modern surgery. John Hunter, the father of scientific surgery. Claude Bernard gave the term milieu interior, with the word homeostasis given by Walter Cannon. So, in essence, the concept evolved that the constancy of the milieu interior allowed for the independence of organisms, that complex homeostasis responses sought to maintain this constancy, and that within this range of responses were the elements of healing and repair. These ideas pertain to normal physiology and mild or moderate injury. In the modern era, such concepts do not account for disease evolution following major injury or sepsis and the injured patient who would have died but for artificial organ support. Such patients exemplified less of the classical homeostasis control system, the signal detector, processor, effector regulated by a negative feedback loop, and more of the open loop system, whereby only with medical or surgical resolution of the primary abnormality is a return to classical homeostasis possible. As a consequence of modern understanding of the metabolic response to injury, elective surgical practices seek to reduce the need for the homeostasis response by minimizing the primary insult, known as minimal access surgery. For example, the minimal access surgery and the stress-free perioperative care. We are trying to reduce uh, the primary insult so that we can maintain the homeostasis better by these elective surgical practices. This is minimal access surgery and stress-free perioperative care. So in emergency surgery, where the presence of tissue trauma, sepsis, hypovolemia often compounds the primary problem, there is a requirement to augment artificially homeostasis responses, which is resuscitation, and to close the open loop by intervening to resolve the primary insult, the surgical treatment of major abdominal sepsis, and provide organ support. While the patient comes back to a situation in which homeostasis can achieve a return to normality. Summary box 1.1. Basic concepts. Homeostasis is the foundation of normal physiology. One liner. Stress free perioperative care helps to preserve homeostasis following elective surgery. Can come under all except who, which of the following are true, all except kind of questions. Homeostasis is the foundation of normal physiology. Stress-free perioperative care helps to preserve homeostasis following elective surgery. Resuscitation, surgical intervention, and critical care can return to severely injured patient to a situation in which homeostasis becomes possible once again. This chapter aims to review the mediators of the stress response, the physiological and biochemical pathway changes associated with surgical injury, and the changes in body composition that occur following surgical injury. Emphasis is laid on why knowledge of these events is important to understand the rationale for modern stress free perioperative and critical care. First, the graded nature of the injury response. So, injury response is actually graded. So, it is important to recognize that the response to injury is graded. The more severe the injury, the greater the response. This concept not only applies to physiological or metabolical changes but also to the immunological changes or sequelae. Thus, following elective surgery of intermediate severity, there may be a transient or and modest rise in temperature, heart rate, respiratory rate, energy expenditure, and peripheral white blood cell count. Following major trauma, these changes are accentuated, resulting in the SIRS, systemic inflammatory response syndrome, hypermetabolism, marked catabolism, or multi organ dysfunction, and shock. It is important to recognize that genetic variability plays a key role in determining the intensity of an inflammatory response. Moreover, in certain circumstances, the severity of injury does not lead to a simple dose dependent metabolic response but rather leads to a quantitative different responses. Not only in the metabolic response graded, but it also evolves with time. Also evolves with time. In particular, the immunological sequelae of major injury evolved from a pro-inflammatory state driven primarily by the innate immune system, that is of macrophages. What are the pro-inflammatory state driven? That is macrophages, the neutrophils, dendritic cells, into a compensatory anti-inflammatory response syndrome, that is CARS, characterized by suppressed immunity and diminished resistance to infection. In patients who develop infective complications, the latter will drive ongoing systemic inflammation, the acute phase response, and continued metabolism. That is the compensatory anti-inflammatory response syndrome. Mediators of the metabolic response to injury. The classical neuroendocrine pathways of the stress response consist of afferent nociceptive neurons, the spinal cord, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and pituitary. Corticotropin releasing hormone CRF released from the hypothalamus increases the ACTH release from the anterior pituitary. ACTH then acts on the adrenals to increase the secretion of cortisol. The hypothalamic activation of the sympathetic nervous system causes the release of adrenaline and also stimulates the release of glucagon. Intravenous infusion of a cocktail of these counter-regulatory hormones. What are the counter-regulatory hormones? Glucagon, glucocorticoids, and catecholamines. They reproduce many aspects of metabolic response to injury. These are, however, many other players, including alteration in the insulin release, and its sensitivity, hypersecretion of prolactin and growth hormone in the presence of low circulatory insulin like growth factor 1, and inactivation of peripheral thyroid hormone and gonadal function. Of note, the growth hormone has direct, very important, the growth hormone has direct lipolytic, insulin antagonistic, and pro-inflammatory properties. So if we look at the acute phase neuroendocrine response, the acute phase and the chronic phase. So acute phase is characterized by an actively secreting pituitary and elevated counter-regulatory hormones. Which are the elevated counter-regulatory hormones? The cortisol, the glucagon, the adrenaline. The changes are thought to be beneficial for short-term survival. Acute phase is done. Chronic phase is associated with hypothalamic suppression and low serum levels of the respective target organ hormones, changes contributing to chronic wasting. The innate immunity response, which is principally macrophages, interact with a complex manner with the adaptive immune system, T cell and B cells, in co-generating the metabolic response to injury. Pro-inflammatory cytokines, very important, are interleukin 1, TNF alpha, interleukin 6, interleukin 8. They are produced within first 24 hours and acts directly on the hypothalamus to cause pyrexia. Such cytokines also augment the hypothalamic stress response, and they act directly on skeletal muscles to induce proteolysis while inducing acute phase proteins production in the liver. Pro-inflammatory cytokines also play a complex role in the development of peripheral insulin resistance. Very important. These pro-inflammatory cytokines are causing peripheral insulin resistance. Other important and pro-inflammatory mediators, others are nitric oxide. Or what are the other ones? The TNF alpha, IL1, TNF alpha, IL6, IL8, coming in the first 24 hours, directly acting on the skeletal muscles to produce proteolysis. And they are also other pro-inflammatory mediators known as the nitric oxide. And nitric oxide acts via inducible nitric oxide synthase and a variety of prostanoids. They are cyclooxygenase 2. These are also Changes in the organ function, that is renal hypoperfusion or impairment, may be induced by the excessive vasoconstriction by endogenous factors such as endothelin 1. The most potent vasoconstrictor is endothelin. So within hours of upregulation of pro-inflammatory cytokines, endogenous cytokine antagonists enter the circulation, that is interleukin 1 receptor antagonist IL-1RA and TNF soluble receptors. TNF soluble receptors and interleukin 1RA, they are all anti-inflammatory cytokines. And they act to control the pro-inflammatory response. A complex further series of adaptive changes include the development of Th2 type counter-inflammatory response, which Th2 type counter-inflammatory response regulated by 4, 5, 9, 13, and transforming growth factor beta, very important, which is accentuated and prolonged in critical illness and is characterized by the counter regulatory anti-inflammatory response syndrome and result in the immunosuppression and an increased susceptibility to opportunistic or nosocomial infections. Within the inflamed tissue, the duration of and magnitude of acute inflammation as well as the return to homeostasis are influenced by a group of local mediators known as specialized pro-dissolving mediators. Specialized pro-dissolving mediators, not much important, that include essential fatty acid derived lipoxin, resolvin, protectin, and maricins. These are important. What are these specialized pro-resolving mediators? These are lipoxins, resolvins, protectins, and maricins. Very important. So these endogenous resolution agonists orchestrate the uptake and clearance of apoptotic polymorphonuclear neutrophils. Important. They orchestrate the uptake and clearance and microbial particles. They reduce the pro-inflammatory cytokines and lipid mediators as well as enhancing the removal of cellular debris in the inflammatory milieu. Thus, both at the systemic level, that is endogenous cytokine antagonists, and at the local tissue level, the body attempts to limit the or resolve the inflammatory inflammation-driven dyshomeostasis. This is a beautiful pictorial diagram of various changes during the inflammation. The afferent nociceptive pathways due to injury release the corticotropin releasing hormone. Pituitary is releasing ACTH, anterior pituitary is releasing ACTH. This ACTH acting on adrenals. These adrenals are releasing adrenaline and cortisol. These adrenaline and cortisols are causing hepatic gluconeogenesis. Also, the growth hormone, we saw the growth hormone is causing adipocyte and lipolysis. Very important. Acting on adipocyte and causing lipolysis. Then the sympathetic nervous system is activated. Pancreas is releasing glucagon. Glucagon is also increased. Adrenaline increased. Cortisol increased. Growth hormone increased. What are decreased? Insulin decreased. IGF-1 decreased. Testosterone not needed at the time of injury response. Who needs testosterone? Thyroxine, very important. Thyroxine is also reducing, and these are all causing hypermetabolism. And the inflammatory mediators. We were at pancreas, glucagon, and it causes the hepatic acute phase protein synthesis. Lipolysis, gluconeogenesis, protein degradation, all causing increased glucose levels in the blood. And most important, those inflammatory mediators 1, T6, 8, and TNF alpha. The summary box 1.3. What is systemic inflammatory response syndrome following a major injuries? We know what are the pro-inflammatory cytokines. Very important question. 1, 6, 8, and TNF alpha, and is followed rapidly by increased plasma levels of cytokine antagonists, soluble receptors, that is interleukin 1RA and TNF soluble receptors. If prolonged or excessive, may evolve into a counter-inflammatory response syndrome. There are many complex interactions among the neuroendocrine, cytokine, and metabolic axis. For example, although cortisol is immunosuppressive at high levels, it acts synergistically with IL-6 to promote hepatic acute phase response. Very important. Who acts along with cortisol as immunosuppressive, with the cortisol being an immunosuppressive at higher levels, acts synergistically with interleukin 6 to promote the hepatic acute phase responses. Then ACTH release is enhanced by the pro-inflammatory cytokines and the noradrenergic systems. The resulting rise in cortisol levels may form a weak feedback loop attempting to limit the pro-inflammatory stress response. The resulting rise in the cortisol levels, it weak the feedback loop attempting to limit the pro-inflammatory stress response. So finally, hyperglycemia may aggravate the inflammatory response via substrate overflow in the mitochondria, causing the formation of excess oxygen free radicals and also altering the gene expression to enhance the cytokine productions. At the molecular level, the changes that accompany systemic inflammation are extremely complex. In the recent study, using the network-based analysis of changes in mitochondrial RNA, the expression in leukocytes following exposure to endotoxins, there were changes in the expression of more than 3,700 genes, not very important, with over half showing the decreased expression and in the remaining increased expression. The cell surface receptors, signaling mechanism, and transcription factors that initiate these events are also complex. But an early and important player involves the nucleic factor kappa beta, the family of transcription factors. So the metabolic stress response to injury, to surgery and trauma, the ebb and the flow model, very important, the ebb and the flow model. Now we'll see the ebb and flow model. If you look in the summary box 1.4, the physiological response to injury, the natural response to injury includes immobility, anorexia, catabolism. Very important. The immobility, anorexia, and catabolism. So these changes are designated to aid the survival of the moderate injury in the absence of medical intervention. They may survive with a moderate injury in the absence of medical intervention. Some most important question from this page is the Sir David Cuthbertson, who coined these terms or who found out the ebb and flow phases of metabolic response to injury in humans. The ebb phase begins at the time of injury, lasts approximately 24 to 48 hours. A neat question. It may be attenuated by proper resuscitation, but not completely abolished. An important sentence. It may be attenuated by proper resuscitation, but not completely abolished. The ebb phase is characterized by hypovolemia, decreased basal metabolic rate, reduced cardiac output, hypothermia, lactic acidosis. I'll repeat that ebb phase is characterized by hypovolemia, decreased basal metabolic rate, reduced cardiac output, hypothermia, and lactic acidosis. If you look into the phases of physiological response to injury, here is injury and here is the recovery. This is ebb phase, this is flow phase. Ebb phase going for 24 to 48 hours, then comes the flow phase, leads to catabolism, and then the recovery, which occurs in weeks. The prominent hormone regulating the ebb phase are catecholamines, cortisol, and aldosterone, very important, following the activation of renin-angiotensin systems. So the magnitude of the neuroendocrine response depends on the degree of blood loss and the stimulation of somatic efferent nerves at the site of injury. The main physiological role of the ebb phase is to conserve both circulating volume and energy stores for recovery and repair. What is the main physiological role of ebb phase? To conserve both the circulating volume and energy stores for recovery and repair. Following resuscitation, the ebb phase evolved into a hypermetabolic rate. If resuscitation done, ebb phase goes into hypermetabolic flow phase, which corresponds to systemic inflammatory response syndrome. And this phase involves the mobilization of body energy stores for recovery and repair, and the subsequent replacement of lost or damaged tissue. This is hypermetabolic flow phase. It corresponds to SIRS. It involves the mobilization of body energy stores for recovery and repair, and the subsequent replacement of lost or damaged tissue. It is characterized by the tissue edema from a vasodilation and increased capillary leakage. There is capillary leakage due to trauma, and we will see in the further chapter that it is three times. The capillary leakage is three times. Then there is increased basal metabolic rate, hypermetabolism, increased cardiac output, raised body temperature, leukocytosis, increased oxygen consumption, and increased gluconeogenesis. All the features of hypermetabolism. The flow phase may be subdivided into an initial catabolic. Very important, it is subdivided. Initial catabolic, lasting approximately 3 to 10 days, following by an anabolic phase. Anabolic phase may last for weeks if extensive recovery and repair are required following serious injury. During the catabolic phase, the increased production of counter regulatory hormones, including the catecholamines, cortisol, insulin, and glucagon, and inflammatory cytokines, that are the interleukin 1, interleukin 6, and TNF alpha, they result in significant fat and protein mobilization, leading to significant weight loss and increased urinary nitrogen excretion. These are all happening in the flow phase. And at the end of the flow phase, when recovery is happening, the interleukin 1, 6, TNF alpha, they result in the significant, these are all the inflammatory cytokines. As you remember, interleukin 1, 6, 8, TNF alpha are the inflammatory or pro-inflammatory cytokines, while the interleukin 4, 5, 9, 13 are the anti-inflammatory cytokines. So these result into significant fat and protein mobilization, leading to significant weight loss and increased urinary nitrogen excretion. The increased production of insulin at this time is associated with significant insulin resistance, and therefore the injured patients often exhibit poor glycemic control. The combination of pronounced and prolonged catabolism in association with insulin resistance places the patient within this phase at increased risk of complication. The combination of the catabolism in association with insulin resistance places the patient at increased risk of complication. Obviously, the development of complication will further aggravate the neuroendocrine inflammatory stress response, thus creating a vicious catabolic cycle. So, what are the purpose of endocrine changes following injury? The constellation of neuroendocrine changes following injury acts to provide essential substrate for survival, postpone the anabolism, and optimize the host defense. The neuroendocrine changes following injury lead to provide essential substrate for survival, obviously, postpone the anabolism, obviously, and optimize the host defense. These changes may be helpful in short term but may be harmful in long term, especially to the severely injured patient who would otherwise not survived without medical intervention. Then the key catabolic elements of the flow phase of the metabolic stress response. There are several key elements in the flow phase that largely determine the extent of catabolism and thus govern the metabolic and nutritional care of the surgical patient. It must be remembered that during the response to injury, not all tissues are catabolic. Indeed, the essence of this coordinated response is to allow the body to reprioritize limited resources away from the peripheral tissue, that is muscle, adipose tissue, and skin, and towards the key viscera, that is liver, immune system, and the wound. Hypermetabolism. The majority of the trauma patient, except possibly those with the extensive burns, demonstrate the energy expenditure approximately 15 to 25% above the predicted healthy resting values. The predominant cause appears to be the complex interaction between the central control of the metabolic rate and peripheral energy utilization. In particular, the central thermoregulation caused by the pro-inflammatory cytokine cascade, increased sympathetic activity, and abnormalities in wound circulation. The ischemic areas produce lactate. We know that ischemic areas produce lactate, which must be metabolized by the ATP consuming hepatic Cori cycle. Cori cycle happens in liver, and this lactate is consumed in Cori cycle. Hyperemic areas cause an increase in cardiac output. Increased protein turnover and nutrition support may be increased. Protein may all increase protein energy expenditure. So theoretically, patients' energy expenditure could rise even higher than observed levels following surgery or trauma. But several factors of standard intensive care, including the bed rest, paralysis, ventilation, and external temperature regulation. These are the features of standard intensive care: the bed rest, paralysis, ventilation, and external temperature regulation. They counteract the hypermetabolic driving forces to the stress response. They counteract the hypermetabolic driving forces of the stress response. So furthermore, the skeletal muscle wasting experienced by patients with prolonged catabolism actually limits the volume of metabolically active tissue. If we look at the summary box 1.6, the hypermetabolism following injury is mainly caused by the acceleration of energy dependent metabolic cycles, and limited to modern practice and accounts of elements of routine critical care. Not very important. If you look at this diagrammatical representation, during the metabolic response to injury, the body reprioritized protein metabolism away from the peripheral tissues and towards the key central tissues such as liver. You have to send the protein metabolism towards liver and immune system and wounds. One of the main reasons why the reutilization of amino acids derived from the muscle proteolysis leads to net catabolism is that the increased glutamine and alanine efflux from the muscle is derived in part from the irreversible degradation of branch chain amino acids. Alanine and glutamine, they are going from muscle, adipose tissue, and skin to the liver, immune system, and wound. Important. So, if you look at the alteration in the skeletal muscle protein metabolism, muscle protein is continually synthesized and broken down with the turnover. What is the turnover rate of muscle now in a normal human being? 1 to 2% per day, and with a greater amplitude of changes in protein synthesis, that is twofold, with a plus minus twofold, and then breakdown, which is plus minus 2.25 fold. During the diurnal cycle, under normal circumstances, synthesis equals the breakdown, and the muscle bulk remains constant. If physiological stimuli that promote net muscle protein accretion include feeding, especially the extracellular amino acid concentration, and exercise. Paradoxically, during exercise, skeletal muscle protein synthesis is depressed, but it increases again after rest and feeding. You know that. So, during the catabolic phase of the stress response, the muscle wasting occurs as a result of an increase in muscle protein degradation via enzymatic pathways, coupled with a decrease in the muscle protein synthesis. The major site of protein loss is peripheral skeletal muscle. Question: although the nitrogen losses also occur in the respiratory muscles, predisposing to the patient to hyperventilation, very important, and chest infection. Why there is hypoventilation and chest infection following trauma? Because there is nitrogen loss occurring in the respiratory muscles, which should happen only in the peripheral skeletal muscles. Also happens in the gut, reducing the gut motility. But most important, cardiac muscle appears to be mostly spared. That's it. This is the question. The cardiac muscle does not take part in the injury response to the protein degradation or muscle degradations. Cardiac muscles are spared. So, under extreme conditions of catabolism, major sepsis, this is the extreme condition of catabolism. Urinary nitrogen losses can reach 14 to 20 gram per day, and that is equivalent to a loss of 500 gram of skeletal muscles per day. It may be a direct question that during extreme condition of catabolism, urinary nitrogen loss can reach up to 14 to 20 gram per day, and with the equivalent loss of 500 gram of skeletal muscle per day. It is remarkable that muscle catabolism cannot be inhibited fully by providing the artificial nutrition support as long as the stress response continues. Indeed, in critical care, it is now recognized that hyperalimentation represents a metabolic stress in itself, and the nutritional support could be at a modest level to attenuate rather than replace energy and protein losses. Not important. The predominant mechanism involved in the wasting of skeletal muscle is ATP dependent ubiquitin proteasome pathway. Direct question: ATP dependent ubiquitin proteasome pathway is the major mechanism of skeletal muscle wasting. Although the lysosomal cathepsins and calcium calpain pathway may also play a role. Clinically, a patient with skeletal muscle wasting will experience asthenia, increased fatigue, reduced nutritional ability, decreased quality of life, and an increased risk of morbidity and mortality. In critically ill patients, muscle weakness may be further worsened by the development of critical illness myopathy, a multifactorial condition that is associated with impaired excitation contraction coupling at the level of the sarcolemma and the sarcoplasmic reticulum membrane. If you look at the summary box 1.7, skeletal muscle wasting provides amino acids for the metabolic support of central organs and tissues, is mediated by a molecular level mainly by the activation of ubiquitin proteasome pathway, a potential question, and can result in immobility and contribute to the hypostatic pneumonia and death if prolonged and excessive. Alteration in the hepatic protein metabolism, the acute phase protein response. The liver and the skeletal muscle together account for the more than 50% of the daily protein requirement. Skeletal muscle have a large mass but a very low turnover rate. We saw it is 1.1 to 2% per day, whereas the liver has a relatively small mass but a high protein turnover. This is the turnover rate of protein liver, protein turnover rate of liver, that is 10 to 20% per day, contrary to skeletal muscle protein turnover rate 1 to 2% per day. So hepatic protein synthesis is divided roughly 50-50 between the renewal of structured protein and synthesis of export proteins. So albumin is the major export protein produced by the liver and is renewed at the rate of 10% per day. Important potential question. My bad. Albumin is a major export protein produced by the liver and is renewed at the rate of 1% or 10% per day. So the transcapillary escape rate, I told you that it will come in the later part of the chapter, that the transcapillary escape rate of albumin about 10 times the rate of synthesis, and short-term changes in albumin concentration are most probably due to increased vascular permeability. Albumin transcapillary escape rate may be increased threefold following major injury or sepsis. This is the question. What is the transcapillary escape rate of albumin? It is about 10 times the rate of synthesis. So most of the albumin will escape the capillaries normally, but it may increase threefold following major injury or sepsis, leading to the edema. Now, in response to inflammatory condition, including the surgery, trauma, sepsis, cancer, or autoimmune conditions, the circulating peripheral blood mononuclear cells secrete a range of pro-inflammatory cytokines. We already know that. Interleukin 1, 6, TNF alpha. If you look into this intracellular effector mechanism involved in the degrading of myofibrillar protein into the free amino acid, the ubiquitin proteasome pathway, there are three enzymes responsible. One is E1. E1 is the protein with ubiquitin for degradation of proteasome. E1 is ubiquitin activating enzyme. E2 is ubiquitin conjugating enzyme. E3 is ligase. Three enzymes. So these cytokines, in particular the IL-6, promote the hepatic synthesis of positive acute phase reactants, the fibrinogen and CRP. Important potential question. The acute phase protein response represents a double-edged sword. We know that acute phase proteins are double-edged sword for the surgical patient, as it provides protein important for recovery and repair, but only at the expense of valuable lean tissue and energy reserves. So, in contrast to the positive acute phase reactants, the plasma concentration of other liver export proteins, the negative acute phase reactants that fall acutely following injury. However, rather than representing a reduced hepatic synthesis rate, the fall in plasma concentration of negative acute phase reactants is thought principally to reflect increased transcapillary rate. We'll read again that, however, rather than representing a reduced hepatic synthesis rate, a fall in plasma concentration of negative acute phase reactant is thought principally to reflect the transcapillary. So they are saying that, in contrary to positive acute phase reactant, the plasma concentration of other liver export proteins, the negative fall, this is example is albumin. Albumin is negative acute phase protein, very important. And why it is falling? Because there is increased transcapillary escape. We saw that it's threefold, secondary to an increase in microvascular permeability. Not only the transcapillary escape rate is increased, it also associated with the increase in microvascular permeability. So thus increased hepatic synthesis of positive acute phase reactants is not compensated by reduced synthesis of negative reactants. So hepatic acute phase response, the hepatic acute phase response represents a reprioritizing of body protein metabolism towards the liver and is characterized by positive reactants, for example CRP, negative reactants, for example albumin, plasma concentration decreasing. A very important and potential question in the upcoming exams. Now, the insulin resistance. The following surgery or trauma, the post-operative hyperglycemia develops as a result of increased glucose production combined with the decreased glucose uptake in the peripheral tissues. The decreased glucose uptake is a result of insulin resistance, which is transiently induced within the stressed patient. Suggested mechanism for this phenomena include the action of pro-inflammatory cytokines. Why it is happening? Because of action of pro-inflammatory cytokines and decreased responsiveness of insulin regulated glucose transport proteins. The degree of insulin resistance is proportional, very important, the proportional to the magnitude of the injurious process. Following routine upper abdominal surgery, insulin resistance may persist for about 2 weeks. Straightforward question. Upper abdominal surgery हुआ, insulin resistance will persist for approximately 2 weeks. So, in post-operative patient with insulin resistance behave in a similar manner in individuals with type 2 diabetes. Same manner. The mainstay of management of insulin resistance is intravenous insulin infusion. So, insulin infusion, this is the mainstay. This is the mainstay treatment of insulin resistance is intravenous insulin infusion. So, insulin infusion may be used in either an intensive approach, sliding scales, or manipulated to normal, or as a conservative approach, that is insulin is administered when the blood glucose level exceed a defined limit and discontinued when the level falls. We have already saw in our residencies how we use the sliding scales and the conservative approach. So while some studies of post-operative ventilated patients in the ICU have suggested that maintenance of normal glucose levels using intensive insulin therapy can significantly reduce both morbidity and mortality. This is an important point. Directly, that ICU studies have suggested the maintenance of normal glucose levels using intensive insulin therapy can significantly reduce both morbidity and mortality. So, the risks of adverse events following significant hypoglycemia as a consequence of ICU therapy have led most ICUs to adopt a more conservative approach to glycemic control. It should be noted that diabetic, though the best method is the intensive control, but the significant hypoglycemia is not letting them to do that. It should be noted that diabetic patients whose glycemic control has been poor prior to the critical illness pose a particular challenge. जिनका पहले से ही poor है. Changes in body composition following injury. So the average 70 kg male can be considered of consist of 13 kg of fat and fat-free mass 57 kgs. So in such an individual, the lean tissue is composed primarily of protein, water 42 kg and minerals 3 kg. We know that 60% is of lean tissue mass is water. So the protein mass can be considered as two basic compartments. The protein mass, two basic compartments, skeletal muscle, the 4 kgs, almost around 0.5%. Sorry, 5%. And non-skeletal muscle, that is 8 kgs, which includes the almost around 70 kg में 8 kgs non-skeletal muscle, that is around 10%. Non-skeletal muscle 10%, skeletal muscle around 5% of a healthy meal. So which includes the visceral protein mass, this non-skeletal proteins. So the water mass at 42 liters is divided into intracellular. Intracellular is almost around two-third, we can say. Two-third is intracellular water and one-third is extracellular water. So most of the mineral mass is contained in the bony skeleton. These are the chemical body composition of a normal 70 kg male. This is the fat and that is fat-free mass or lean body mass, in which the intracellular water is the most, and that is two-third of total water, and this is extracellular water. The main labile energy reserve. This is an important question. The main labile energy reserve of the body is fat, and the main labile protein reserve is skeletal muscle. I'll repeat. The main labile energy source in the body is fat, and the main labile energy protein reserve in the body is skeletal muscles. While fat mass can be reduced without major detriment to function, loss of protein mass will result not only in skeletal muscle wasting but also in the depletion of visceral protein status. So within the lean tissue, each 1 gram of nitrogen is contained within 6.25 gram of protein. Within lean tissue, 1 gram nitrogen is within 6.25 gram of protein, which is contained in approximately 30 gram of wet weight tissue. So 30 gram of wet weight tissue is equal to 6.25 gram of protein is equal to 1 gram of nitrogen. I'll repeat that 36 gram of wet weight tissue is equal to 6.25 gram of protein is equal to 1 gram nitrogen. Thus, the loss of 1 gram of nitrogen in urine is equivalent to the breakdown of 36 gram of wet weight lean tissue. So, protein turnover in the whole body of the order of, this is the protein turnover of the whole body of the order of 150 to 200 gram per day. So, a normal human ingests about 70 to 100 gram protein per day, which is metabolized and excreted in urine as ammonia and urea approximately 4. This is normal. 14 gram of nitrogen per day. So during total starvation, all these data are very important for exam purpose. So during total starvation, urinary loss of nitrogen is rapidly attenuated by a series of adaptive changes. Loss of body weight follows a similar course, thus secreting and accounting for the survival of hunger strikers for a period of 50 to 60 days. It means that loss of body weight follows a similar course, accounting for the survival. So survive कहाँ कब तक कर सकते हैं on your body protein is 50 to 60 days. Very important. So following a major injury and particularly in the presence of ongoing septic complication, this adaptive changes fails to occur and there is a state of autocannibalism. If the recovery is not happening, patient is going into further septic complications, there will be autocannibalism, and this is resulting in the continuing urinary nitrogen losses equivalent to 500 gram of wet weight lean tissue. Normally it should happen just normally daily it should be 14 gram nitrogen excretion per day, but it may lead to 500 20 gram of nitrogen and 500 gram of wet weight lean tissue. These are the changes in the body weight that occur in a serious sepsis after uncomplicated surgery. After uncomplicated surgery in a serious sepsis. So, this is the weight gain, this is the weight loss in sepsis and multi organ failure. This is what happening initial days and later on. In uncomplicated major surgeries, this is the weight loss, and in starvation, this is the weight loss. As with the total starvation, once loss of body protein mass has reached 30 to 40% total, survival is unlikely. This is important question. Survival is unlikely when your loss of body protein mass has reached 30 to 40% of your total. Critically ill patients admitted to the ICU with severe sepsis of major blunt trauma undergo massive changes in the body composition. Body weight increases immediately on resuscitation with an expansion of extracellular water by 6 to 10 liters within. Body weight increases immediately on resuscitation with an expansion of extracellular water by 6 to 10 liters within 24 hours. Thereafter, even with optimal metabolic rate and nutritional support, total body protein will diminish by 15% in the next 10 days. So, and body weight will reach negative balance as the expansion of extracellular space dissolves. In marked contrast, it is now possible to maintain body weight and nitrogen equilibrium following major elective surgeries. This can be achieved by blocking the neuroendocrine stress response with epidural analgesia and other techniques, and providing early oral and enteral feeding. Early oral or enteral feeding. Moreover, the early fluid retention phase can be avoided by careful intra-op management of the fluid balance with avoidance of excessive administration of intravenous saline. These are the changes in the body composition following major surgeries or critical illness. There is catabolism lead to decrease in fat mass and skeletal muscle mass. Second, this body weight may paradoxically increase because of expansion of extracellular fluid space. What are the avoidable factors? Avoidable factors that compound the response to injury. As noted previously, the main features of metabolic response are initiated by the immune system, cardiovascular system, sympathetic nervous system, and ascending reticular formation and limbic system. However, the metabolic stress response may be further exacerbated by the anesthesia, dehydration, starvation, sepsis, acute medical illness, or even severe psychological stress. Attempts to limit or control these factors can be beneficial to the patient. What are the avoidable factors that compound the response to injury? Avoidable factors that compound the response to injury: continuing hemorrhage, hypothermia, tissue edema, tissue underperfusion, starvation, and immobility. These are the avoidable factors basically that compound the response to injury. The continued hemorrhage, you should control that. Hypothermia, you can control that. Tissue edema, you can control that. Underperfusion can be controlled. Starvation, immobility can be controlled. These are all avoidable factors. Volume loss during the simple hemorrhage, pressure receptors in the carotid artery and the aortic arch and volume receptors in the wall of the left atrium initiate the efferent nerve inputs to the central nervous system, resulting in the release of both aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone. Pain can also stimulate ADH release. ADH acts directly on the kidneys to cause fluid retention, and decreased pulse pressure stimulates the juxtaglomerular apparatus in the kidneys and directly activates the renin-angiotensin system, which in turn increases the aldosterone release. Now, this aldosterone causes the renal tubule. It's a normal physiological process we have already read about many times, that decreased pulse pressure will stimulate the juxta-GG apparatus in the kidney, directly activates the RAS, and in turn increase the aldosterone. What will aldosterone do? Aldosterone causes the renal tubule to reabsorb sodium and consequently also the conserve water. ACTH release also augments. ACTH release will also augment the aldosterone response. The net effect of ADH and aldosterone result in the natural oliguria that is observed after surgery and conservation of sodium and water in the extracellular space. The tendency towards water and salt retention is exacerbated by resuscitation with saline rich fluids. Salt and water retention can result in not only peripheral edema but also visceral edema in the stomach. Such visceral edema has been associated with reduced gastric emptying, delayed resumption of fluid intake, and prolonged hospital stay. These fluid retention, the visceral edema, they are leading to reduced gastric emptying, delayed resumption of food intake, and prolonged hospital stay. The careful limitation of intraoperative administration of balanced crystalloids. So there is no wet gain. And following elective surgery has been proven to reduce the post-op complication and length of stay. Hypothermia. Hypothermia. Before proceeding to hypothermia, we will see the figure 1.9. What does it say? That immobilization, starvation, all leading to catabolism, more of catabolism and less of anabolism. Immobilization and starvation. So, what wound, hypothermia, hypotension, and pain? These four factors of metabolic response to injury or the wound, hypothermia, hypotension, and pain, they will do the adrenosympathetic activation or cytokine cascade release, leading to pyrexia, acute phase response, insulin resistance, futile substrate cycling, muscle protein degradation, ultimately leading to catabolism. More of catabolism, less of anabolism. So you have to control hypothermia, hypotension, pain, or wound complications to reduce the patient undergoing more of catabolism. Let's proceed towards the hypothermia. Hypothermia results in an increased elaboration of adrenal steroids and catecholamines. When compared with normothermic controls, even mild hypothermia results in a 2 to 3 fold increase in post-op cardiac arrhythmia and increased catabolism. Even mild hypothermia will lead to 2 to 3 fold increase in post-op cardiac arrhythmias and increased catabolism. Randomized trials have shown that maintaining normothermia by an upper body forced air heating cover reduces the wound infection, cardiac complication, and bleeding and transfusion requirement. You have to control the hypothermia in intra-op. And how will you control intra-op? By upper body forced air heating covers. They reduce the wound infection, cardiac complication. Tissue edema during the systemic inflammation, fluid, plasma proteins, leukocytes, macrophages, and electrolytes leave the vascular space accumulated in the tissues due to increased transcapillary escape rate and also due to increased capillary permeability. This can diminish the alveolar diffusion of oxygen and it may lead to the reduced renal function, and increased capillary leak is mediated by a wide variety of mediators including cytokines, prostanoids, bradykinin, and nitric oxide. The vasodilation implies that intravascular volume decreases, which induces shock if inadequate resuscitation is not undertaken. And meanwhile, the intracellular volume decreases, and this provides part of the volume necessary to replenish intravascular and extracellular tissue volume. Then, systemic inflammation and tissue underperfusion. The vascular endothelium controls the vascular tone, vasomotor tone, and microvascular flow and regulates the trafficking of nutrients and biologically active molecules. When endothelial activation is excessive, compromised microcirculation and subsequent cellular hypoxia contribute to the risk of organ failure. Maintaining the normoglycemia with insulin infusion during the critical illness has been proposed to protect the endothelium, probably in part via inhibition of excessive. They are saying that maintaining normoglycemia with insulin infusion during the critical illness has been proposed to protect the endothelium. It protects the endothelium, like it reduces the transcapillary escapes, it reduces the capillary permeability if your endothelium is protected via inhibition of excessive nitric oxide induced NOS induced nitric oxide release. Starvation. During starvation, the body is faced with an obligate need to generate glucose to sustain the cerebral energy metabolism. That is 100 gram of glucose per day. This is the cerebral energy metabolism. This is achieved in the first 24 hours by In the first 24 hours, it is achieved by mobilizing glycogen stores, and thereafter by hepatic gluconeogenesis from amino acids, glycerol, and lactate. The energy metabolism of other tissue is sustained by mobilizing fat from other tissues. Other tissues, energy metabolism other than brain may be sustained by mobilizing fat from adipose tissue, but not in brain. In brain, you need amino acids, glycerol, and lactate to produce hepatic glucogenesis. Such fat metabolism is mainly dependent on the fall in circulating insulin levels, eventually accelerated loss of lean tissue, the main source of amino acids for the lean tissue, which is the main source of amino acids for hepatic gluconeogenesis, is reduced and is a result of liver converting free fatty acid into ketones. The free fatty acids converting into ketones, which can serve as a substitute for glucose for cerebral energy later on. Initially, CNS will not use ketone bodies, and later on, it will also start utilizing ketone bodies. So, provision of 2 liters of intravenous 4% dextrose as maintenance intravenous fluid for surgical patients who are fasted prolonged provides 80 gram of glucose per day. Very important that provision of 2 liters of IV 4% dextrose or 0.18% sodium chloride, not 0.9, it is 0.18, not 0.09, it is 0.18% sodium chloride as a maintenance intravenous fluid for surgical patients who are fasted provides 80 gram of glucose per day and has a significant protein sparing effect. So, avoiding unnecessary fasting in this first instance and early oral, parenteral, or enteral nutrition form the platform for avoiding loss of body mass as a result of the varying degree of starvation observed in surgical patients. Modern guidelines on fasting prior to anesthesia allow the intake of clear. Nowadays, you have to allow the patient 2 hours prior. The clear fluids. Clear fluids can be taken 2 hours before the surgery, and preferably carbohydrate rich drink. It reduces the perioperative anxiety and thirst and decreases the post-op insulin resistance. Immobility. Immobility has long been recognized as potent stimulus for inducing muscle wasting. Inactivity impairs the normal meal-derived amino acid stimulus and by protein synthesis in skeletal muscles. So, avoidance of unnecessary bed rest and active energy metabolism are essential measures to avoid muscle wasting as a consequence of immobility. What are the concepts behind enhanced recovery after surgery? Enhanced recovery after surgery, ERAS, very important point. ERAS. What is ERAS? Current understanding of the metabolic response to surgical injury and the mediators involved has led to a reprisal of traditional perioperative care. There is now a strong scientific rationale for avoiding unmodulated exposure to stress, prolonged fasting, and excessive administration of IV fluids. The widespread adoption of minimal access surgery is a key change in surgical practice that can reduce the magnitude of surgical injury and enhance the rate of patient return to homeostasis and recovery. It is also important to realize that modulating the stress or inflammatory response at the time of surgery may have long-term sequelae over periods of months or longer. For example, beta blockers and statins have been shown to improve long-term survival after major surgery. It has been suggested that these effects may be due to suppression of innate immunity, suppression of innate immunity at the time of surgery. Equally in open surgery, the use of epidural analgesia, beta blockers, statins, epidural analgesia, they block the cortisol stress response and attenuate the post-op insulin resistance may via effects on the body's protein economy favorably affect many of the protein centered outcomes that are important to post-op recovery. These three, the beta blockers, statins, and the epidural analgesia, they are helping to improve the recovery after surgery. Due to the reduction in wound size, yes, and tissue trauma, it should be noted that epidural analgesia is no longer recommended if your wound size is low and tissue trauma is less. No need for epidural analgesia like in laparoscopic surgery. Very important point. Very, very important point. So, patient controlled analgesia is usually sufficient. Patient controlled analgesia. is usually sufficient. Adjuncts such as one shot spinal diamorphin or 6 to 12 hour infusion of IV lidocaine have been suggested to be opiate sparing to improve the gut function and enhanced overall recovery. This is important point, that patient controlled analgesia is sufficient, but adjuncts such as the one shot spinal diamorphin and or a 6 to 12 hours infusion of intravenous lidocaine have been suggested to be opiate sparing to improve gut function and enhance recovery. What? One shot spinal diamorphin and 6 to 12 hour infusion. Summary box 1.11. The last summary box, last and the first summary box are usually very important. A proactive approach to prevent unnecessary aspects of the surgical stress response. What are those? Minimal access techniques. Second, blockade of afferent painful stimuli by epidural, spinal, or wound catheters. Minimal periods of starvation, early mobilization. You have to remember these 4 points. They are involved for ERAS. What are those? I'll repeat again. One, minimal access techniques. Second, blockade of afferent painful stimuli by epidural, spinal analgesia or wound catheters. Third, minimal periods of starvation. And fourth is early mobilization. Thank you.